In this video, I want to talk about things that AI can do now as of late 2022, and also why we might care. I've structured this video into two parts. The first part is a high-level summary, so you can just watch that if you're short on time. If you have a bit more time, then I'll go through some more detailed examples of each of the different tools that I'm talking about, and also talk about why I think we could be at a pretty important time in terms of determining the trajectory of long-term flourishing and well-being, and decisions about how we develop and use AI could have a significant impact on that trajectory. So here are some examples of AI tools as of late 2022. I've put them into three categories just for the purposes of discussion. The first is image generation. The second is speech transcription and synthesis. So this is turning vocal speech into text or turning text into vocal speech. And then also text generation with large language models. So this is using text to generate more text. So some of the use cases for these different categories of AI tools, when it comes to image generation in a research sense, it could be quite useful to use these image generation tools to create illustrations or images for presentations or reports that you might be writing. You could also use it to generate stimuli or materials for research in terms of presenting things to participants or putting them on posters or flyers to um, increase the awareness of the work that you might be doing. In general, these image generation tools are quite cheap and getting better all the time, between 3 and 15 cents per image. When it comes to speech transcription and synthesis, um, uh, this is either turning spoken words into text or turning text into spoken words. At the moment, the capability of these tools is that they can transcribe research interviews at very high fidelity. Um, you could use them to generate transcripts of talks that could be shared in order to increase the accessibility or for communications or marketing, or to just transform one kind of content into other kinds of content. So the example that I'm showing here is a short introduction to behavior science, and you could generate a transcript very readily from this that's very readable. And you could also use it to convert written scripts into spoken content. So perhaps you have a article or report that you'd like to make easier for people to listen to on their commute, or to be embedded into some other kind of interview. Then you could convert that script into podcast or spoken content. And then finally, and this is sort of very brief introduction in this section, but text generation with large language models work a little bit like a super-powered predictive text on a phone or in Google Docs. So um, in general, you provide some amount of text and the model predicts what is likely to come next, and is usually quite helpful, quite consistent over a relatively short time frame, or length of total text. So this means that you could use it quite helpfully for outlining, drafting, and editing already. You could use it to write and explain some programming or data analysis code in your research workflow. But you could also use it to plan, brainstorm, or critique project ideas, help set up a project, think about potential problems that would emerge from a course of action, or even generate kind of critical questions that you might want to consider before presenting your work to others. And it can also be useful even now for replacing Google search, particularly for complex and non-factual queries. For example, how do I negotiate a higher salary? Or can you give me some suggestions about how to defuse a tense situation with a partner? Something like that. So that's the short overview. I'm now going to talk a little bit more detail about each of these tools, starting with image generation. So 2022 has been a really big year for image generation. DALL-E 2, which was released by a company called OpenAI, and Midjourney was released publicly in mid-2022. And depending on the complexity of the images that are being generated and the particular service or product, the price of these images is quite low. So usually around about 3 cents to 15 cents per image. And the way that they typically worked is from a text or an image prompt. So you feed some text into the model and it generates an image for you. So here you can see an example of an image generated from the text prompt, a pack of cyclists riding on Melbourne city streets and so on. Here's another example. So you can see here the text prompt is a young person placing plastic litter in a green bin with a recycling symbol in an Australian nature setting. Um, the feature of some of these models at the moment is that you're able to create variations on a particular on a particular output. So if you're not quite happy with one, you can generate more. There's also some limited ability to expand or edit um, an image that's been generated. So in fact, with the image that you're seeing now, I didn't like the first version of the recycling symbol that was shown, and so I painted out that piece of the image and asked it to regenerate. But you could also extend the gum tree to go further up. And one of the key tells for these sorts of models at the moment is that the hands are often a little bit off. So if you look quite closely, you might be able to see that the fingers are not well delineated, and at the tips of the fingers, they kind of blend together. This is a current tell for AI generated images at the moment, but I expect that that will be solved quite soon. So moving to speech, so speech translation, transcription, and synthesis. In speech transcription, there are many different products and models. One that I've just highlighted here is from OpenAI again. They called it Whisper. It was released in September and updated in December 2022, and is really dramatically more accurate than most existing automatic transcription services. So you might be familiar with Zoom transcription or even Google writing from voice. I've found Whisper to be really exceptionally better. It can convert speech to text, it can translate, and it can transcribe from other languages as well. So you can see here, this is a Whisper generated transcript when I fed a YouTube video in, and the phrasing is picking up commas, it's picking up more technical language like anthropology, sociology, psychology. Um, so in general, it's quite good and would use reasonably low editing in order to turn it into a report or an article that could be shared elsewhere. So in the other direction, so if transcription is turning speech into text, synthesis is turning text into speech. And there are many different services that can now do this, but they have gotten really significantly better over the past couple of years. One is called Azure Neural TTS, text to speech. Another one, Murph.ai, is one among many different services that offer voiceovers from some kind of written script. It tends to work pretty well, although you can usually tell that it's not quite a real person speaking, particularly it's because it's a little bit more fluent, but also there's sometimes unnatural pauses or an unnatural rhythm in the speech and choices of tone. It works quite well for very particular styles, so where there's say for example, there's an advertisement style or an explainer video type style, something like that. And so here's a really quick example of one that's selling like a clothing website. So that's all generated from just a script that was given to that model. And so then coming back to this question of large language models, so we've had image generation, we've had speech transcription and synthesis. Large language models also tend to be related to or sometimes used in conjunction with those, but operating sort of in their own right are very, very powerful ways in which you can use some amount of text to generate more text. And this basic relationship between text that you feed it and text that it generates gets really, really powerful when you think about giving that model feedback on text that is generated or iterating over multiple versions of a piece of text. And so you can think about it a little bit like phone text prediction, but much, much more powerful. So it tends to be uses like billions or trillions of words or web pages or any kind of text gets sucked up by the model, and associations between words are baked into the model, which means that its capability is very human-like. It tends to write in complete sentences and paragraphs rather than word by word like a predictive text model would. So one of the ones that's been released at the very end of 2022 is called ChatGPT, um, and it's as of late 2022, it's free to use. I highly recommend playing around with it to get a sense of just what these models can do at the moment. So a couple of really basic examples that I'll show you here. One is sending an email from dot points. So writing, asking it to write a persuasive and professional email that covers several points, and it will transform those dot points into an email that you could then edit and send. Perhaps you're planning a workshop or a meeting and you needed to ensure that there were certain outcomes that were achieved throughout the meeting in a particular time. So in this case, the qualitative text program in Vivo for PhD students. And so feeding that request to create an outline, you can see some of the output here. And you can also use it to summarize information, so not just generate from a short prompt, but give a long prompt and ask it to condense it. And so here I've pasted in a scholarly abstract and asked it to extract several elements of the information from that abstract, and it's done that, and I even asked it to put in a table, and it did that as well. So you can see it's picked out that the population of this abstract was Chinese university students. There were several theoretical frameworks described and so on. I think that these basic examples are sometimes a little bit underwhelming, but really the power of these large language models comes through iteration and feedback. And so here's an example. So perhaps you have a new research project in which you're trying to reduce littering in national parks. So you might prompt the model to say, give me 3 dot point ideas for doing this. And so it gives you, several ideas. But then what you could do is you could say, well, maybe this is an okay starting point, but I want to do some searching for research that's done this myself. So what you would ask it is saying, well, give me some useful keywords to search about this. And I've given it also some information about sort of how to give it back to me so that it's easy to put into some search engine. So here it suggested a bunch of different topics or keywords that it thinks are relevant. And so then at this stage, you could do any number of things with this information about different strategies and different keywords that are relevant to the project. And you could also prompt it with perhaps like an executive summary or a project description that you might have already created for the project. But here I'm just going to show how you could take this stage and turn it into like many more threads of exploration or iterated thinking. So you can ask it to write a scopus search. That's what's in the top right-hand corner for a database search. Or you could think, okay, if we want to develop these strategies with some useful input, who are different groups of stakeholders who should be involved? Or perhaps you use those keywords to find a particular report, but it's really long and you're just trying to summarize, the top 10 Google results. So you could copy the executive summary and ask it to summarize it for you. Or you could be looking to communicate with others in a marketing way about this new project that you're doing and what you're working on. You might want to use keywords for that as well. And so then you might ask it to write, several tweets that you can then pick from and edit in order to reduce that burden on people who are not themselves, highly skilled in marketing or comms. And so it'll quite readily give responses to each of these different elements, and then you could continue to chain that down. Perhaps you um, find these 3 groups of stakeholders. You might want to generate email invitations to them, or you might want to reflect on how it is that they might give specific valuable input. When it comes to summarizing the report and the strategies, perhaps you have a summary of one report and you have a summary of another report, and you want to contrast the perspectives that they give. So you could also ask it to do that. Or once you've started writing these tweets, you could be thinking about what are other kinds of social media or communications materials you might want to create, like a LinkedIn post or a script for a YouTube video that introduces the project or reports on some results of the project. So I hope that you can see that when it comes to these large language models, it's the iterative and sort of feedback nature that starts to make them very, very powerful. And something like ChatGPT is already implementing this iterative process. So I've talked a bit so far about what are the use cases right now. So when it comes to image generation, the use cases right now is to illustrate reports. When it comes to speech transcription and synthesis, you could use it to transcribe interviews, to turn written text into spoken text that could be used in a short info um, video that you put on LinkedIn, for example. And text generation with large language models can be used in lots of relatively short writing tasks. But if we think about like what's likely to happen next and likely to happen, in the next versions of these models, so in the next year or 5 years, and one way you can think about this is that if Apple's releasing an iPhone every year, then these companies are also releasing products, every year or faster than that. So the speed of iteration of this work is extremely quick, and also these companies are using these methods or these tools in order to help them with their work as well. So that means that it's likely that the rate of progress in these areas is going to continue to accelerate. So if we think about what the next use case could be for some of these tools, when it comes to image generation, I could imagine it starting to be able to use much richer text in generating images or figures or infographics. And so you might feed it a report or a section of a report, and it will be able to generate or select images that would be useful for illustrating some of the findings or the arguments in that report. When it comes to speech transcription and synthesis, I could imagine it beginning to start automatically conducting interviews from a script that you give it, and it could even do this with non-English speakers, which might allow you to, increase the representation of non-English speakers within the research which you conduct, or conduct international research more readily. It could also then be used to translate and transcribe essentially any recording that's extant. So you could imagine it recording kind of every meeting that you have just normally, and then transcribing it so that you can search that later, and the quality of the transcription will be extremely high, which means that it's a lot easier to pick up on notes or discussions that you've previously had. And when it comes to text generation with large language models, I think that it's likely to be quite difficult to predict just where these will go next. But some ideas of um, the next generation of these models is likely to be some kind of data analysis and reporting that's based on something quite simple like a research question or hypothesis, and perhaps you've provided some data to that model. So perhaps it would write and then execute some R code that would both clean the data, analyze it, present figures, or present some visualization that would help to answer the research question. But then you could also use these sorts of models to uh, start doing much longer writing that would be more coherent and consistent with a particular organizational or professional or disciplinary style, especially if those models are aware of or trained on scientific journal style. And I also think that the next version is likely to be getting better and better at what I call low context, high competence research, um, or administration or marketing. And by this I mean you can almost imagine that today the models are a bit like getting a smart teenager volunteer to come into your organization, and it's their first day. And so they know like a lot about a lot of things, and they know how to kind of find information out, but they don't really know anything about your organization. And they also don't know that much about like what's right or wrong. So you can prompt them with some context, but they can't kind of hold a lot of rich context for a long time. And I would imagine that the next version of the models are going to be more like a research assistant, or a marketing assistant or administration assistant, where it can consider more and more context. You could feed it in, the shared drive of your organization, and then it would have a much sort of richer understanding of the sorts of concepts that are discussed within the organization or projects that are happening in the organization, and therefore it would increase in its ability to provide useful support. But just as I talked about how some of these other models, sorry, these other tools are starting to connect these together, I also think that it's worth considering that it's quite likely that in the next several years that we'll see more and more combinations or chains of these models used in different ways. So an example might be something like um, you could imagine automatically conducting an interview that then gets transcribed, and then that transcription could be analyzed by a large language model and synthesized into some report or summary, and then a visualization of figures or infographics or some sort of image could be generated that would summarize or otherwise communicate that work. And then the whole thing could be packaged up and turned into a video because you can synthesize text, synthesize voice from text, or put on LinkedIn or posted to Twitter or something like that. So it's really the combinations of these different tools that I see as being more and more likely over the next couple of years. And what this kind of is likely to lead to or emerge alongside it is this idea of what's called intelligent agents. And so this is essentially um, uh, programs or models that are able to sense environment and then like make plans and execute on plans within the environment. And so quite apart from these tools, you've seen this in playing lots of games like chess or Go, or even quite sophisticated and complex video games. And quite recently, as of late 2022, there was also the announcement that there was more social games. So there's a social game called Diplomacy in which the different players are trying to um, compete with each other as nation states. And an agent model was able to effectively kind of outcompete other players in that game. So as intelligent agents become um, uh, more common or become to be developed, then you might see less like research administration or marketing assistants, but you would actually imagine um, those agents being able to interact with the world or with content, make plans and execute on them. So perhaps instead of assistants, there will be marketers, there'll be researchers, or lawyers or CEOs, something like that. And so really that leads me to as sort of the final point, just connecting a lot of these tools and use cases out into a broader discussion about the implications of what these tools um, are, might look like, and also the potential trajectories that the increasing development and use of these tools could have on overall human well-being and flourishing. And there's reason to believe that we are, or we could be, at a quite important inflection point in these trajectories. And as an applied behavioral scientist, I think that it really comes down to human decision making and human behavior about how we develop and use these systems that is going to shift us from one trajectory to another in terms of whether we massively increase human well-being and flourishing, or we massively decrease human well-being and flourishing and even go extinct. And so this connects to the ideas of AI safety or AI alignment. How do we build these systems in a way that they reflect human values and preferences and do right by us, particularly when they start being able to interact with the world in some way, um, and the question of how to improve human decision making and behavior is the area of AI governance, which is what I'm very interested in terms of laws, policies, international agreements, and civil society and research. What all of those things and those actors do together in order to try to improve how we develop and use AI in order to maximize well-being and flourishing. So thanks very much. I'll include in the description a link to a lot of these different tools, as well as to the slides if you'd like to consider them yourself. Thanks very much.